Hello, my name is Martin Hazel and I'll be mediating this inaugural webinar for Unlocking Foresight. Today we have a very wide range of participants from North America, Asia, South America, Europe and Africa. During the presentation, feel free to pose any questions via the chat button. If you look at the bottom left of your screen, you'll see a little speech balloon. If you click on that, that will open up the chat window and you can post any question there and see questions and answers posed by others. So, as I say, feel free to pose any questions as we go along, and we'll try and pick these up about halfway through and at the end when we have plenty of time for discussion. Today's webinar will be presented by Jill Ringland, Chief Executive Officer of SAMI Consulting and a Director of Unlocking Foresight. She's an author, advisor to firms, NGOs and governments on foresight. The second half of this presentation will be by Kat Tully, Director of the School of International Futures, advisor to the UN, governments, civil society, especially on sustainability and strategic foresight. Unlocking Foresight, we're creating a community of people using foresight to take action in shaping their own future, supported by the Foresight Hub and events such as this. Working with us today we have SWAF, the School of International Futures, who help organisations use foresight to impact decision making today. They support policymakers and business leaders at making strategic choices, strategic risk, and create future ready organisations. Thank you also to Atkins for hosting this event. We are pleased to be working with an organisation that uses foresight at the heart of planning to enable them and their clients to anticipate the impact of megatrends and plan and design a better future for all. And I'll now hand over to Jill.
Thank you, Martin. So today we're going to be talking about city futures in a time of turbulence. Why are cities important? Well, quite simply because 70% of the world are going to be living in cities by 2050. And we've never been in this position before. And so it's a new frontier. And the question then is, how can cities meet the needs of 9 billion people for a living, for a good quality of life? And how about the time of turbulence? Well, I think everyone would agree it's a time of turbulence. And in fact, the McKinsey Quarterly just last month has started talking about a new narrative of progress relating to new industrial ecology, the growth, the explosive growth in Africa and South Asia, underpinned, of course, by the breakthroughs in the use of technology by ordinary people. So life is going to be pretty different in the future. And there are a lot of people who are experts on city futures. Some of them are listed here, and there may be many people in the audience who know about other experts, other programs, other projects that are looking at city futures. And what we're doing today is thinking about global context. How might the world be? What does this mean for cities and therefore for people? The agenda we'll be following starts with thinking about timescales for change, then tools for dealing with uncertainties, and then thinking about some of the sources of turbulence. Then we'll have a short break, at which it would be a useful time for you to capture some of your thoughts to date, and we will hand over to Kat Tully, who is going to be thinking about cities and communities, particularly 3 applications of scenarios and how they can be used to implement the Sustainable Development Goals which the UN has formulated as encapsulating what makes life desirable for us. And as Martin said at the end, we will have time for discussion and Q&A. Timescales for change. We use a methodology called 3 Horizons, which we find is incredibly intuitive and helps people think about the drivers of change that they see around them in a way that allows a measured and appropriate response, because some of the things that are really, really changing our world fast now are happening now. And in understanding those, it's about analysis and it's about thinking how to deal with them. And so every manager needs to be thinking about Horizon 1 drivers of change. And so the sort of things that we're seeing now in terms of longevity, for instance, managers are having to think about changing pension ages, changing retirement ages, changes in the medical system, here and now. Then there are a number of things which are likely to be changing our world by 2030. And these are things which are probably in development now. Maybe entrepreneurs are starting up businesses to explore them. And a lot of the things that are going to be changing our world in Horizon 2 are likely to be in the biotechnology space, whereas a lot of the Horizon 1 ones, of course, are in the information technology space. And then, if we're thinking about 2050, which is our focus today, you really need to use imagination, because so many things could happen, so many sources of turbulence could cause a very different, a qualitatively different world by 2050. That the best way of getting a handle on 2050 is to use imagination and then think about what could cause these different features. So these are our 3 horizons. And I have to acknowledge at this time that this is not our invention. They were invented by Andrew Curry and Bill Sharp. And there is an excellent book called 3 Horizons, The Patterning of Hope, by Bill Sharp and some co-authors, and absolutely recommend it. Really helpful in thinking about the future. So we were talking about 2050. And we can make some assumptions about 2050. We know, for instance, that because of information technology and the spread of information, that and also because so many more people are off the lowest level of poverty, we know that migration is going to continue to be big right through till 2050. And so the top left-hand picture is out of a dystopian film talking about north-north migration, but of course south-north and south-south migration is even bigger. So one assumption about 2050 is that people are no longer going to be in the same place that they are now. The top right-hand picture is a Japanese picture about an experimental city which is carbon neutral and uses zero net water resources and is pushing the frontiers in a number of ways, because another assumption we can make about 2050 is that the 9 billion of us who are living on the planet will all want clean water, we will all want a varied diet, we will want to travel, we will use electricity, and so how the world can cope with this is a really testing problem. The bottom right-hand corner is a picture of Melbourne, which is built at a very low level on a very muddy estuary. As the sea level rises, Melbourne will have to change from being a largely single-story city into a city of ziggurats because of the rising sea levels. And then the central picture is a picture, in fact, of Kuala Lumpur, because most of the big new cities are going to be in Asia, now, and in the next decades, Africa. So we know about that. Then the bottom left-hand corner is an interesting graph. It's from the United Nations Population Division. And I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is that if you look at the population of the world just after the Second World War, it's around 2 billion. And now it's around 7.5 billion. So in these last decades, the world has done absolutely amazing things in accommodating 3.5 times more people than it had before. So that's good. But then going forward, there's a yellow line, which is best guess, and there's a red line, and there's a green line. And what this suggests is that the best thing the guys at United Nations can do in terms of estimating the global population in 2050 is 9 billion plus or minus 2 billion. Now, if you say 2 billion quickly, it doesn't sound like many, but it's more than the entire population of the world not so long ago. And we've never had this uncertainty about the number of people before. And of course, there are really two factors coming into this. One is urbanization, where women move to cities, they get educated, they have smaller families, and public health is better, so more survive. So there are two potentially contradictory factors there. And then the other factor, of course, is longevity, that people are living longer. And nobody knows which way these compensating forces will turn out in the end. So just summarizing that, global population is going to grow to 9 billion and get older. Well, 9 billion plus or minus 2 billion. There's going to continue to be turbulence as the world rebalances to new centers of economic power away from Europe and North America. Technology is going to continue to introduce changes. Currently, information technology, going forward, increasingly biotechnology, and we're going to continue to be testing or breaching the ecological, energy, and environmental limits. So these are some things we can assume about 2050. But there are a lot of uncertainties. And so one question that I'm sometimes asked is, why, if life's so uncertain, why bother thinking about it? Why not just wait for it to happen? Well, Eisenhower was quite successful at this time. And what he said was, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And so what he is saying is that the thought process of planning is really important. And a plan is useful because then you know when the world is diverging from what you thought was going to happen. Then we've got three other quotations on the right-hand side of the screen. The first is Napoleon Bonaparte, who always liked to appear right. If I always appear prepared, it's because I'm right, roughly. Voltaire took a slightly different approach. Doubt is not pleasant, but certainty is absurd. And then we felt it was important to point out that the person who almost single-handedly brought the particular technology that we're going to be using, scenario planning, into common use as a tool that people use for dealing with uncertainty, planning in the face of uncertainty, is Peter Schwartz, whose book is a small book, The Art of the Long View, a small paperback, but it's incredibly useful because it changed planning in the face of uncertainty from something that was obscure into something that every strategist and every person is likely to want to do. So we're going to be using scenarios to think about the future. And I guess one quick decisive word about scenarios is that scenarios are not forecasts. Obviously, in lots of environment, we need to forecast. But if we're thinking about 2050, it's much more fruitful to explore the range of uncertainties. That's what scenarios do. And the scenarios we're using are in fact from some work we did in SAMI to develop longer term views of the future. It was originally applied to the future of financial services and has been used by a lot of banks, asset managers, and other financial services organizations. But what we found is that it provides some mental models, some pictures, some images of the future that are really useful in a range of disciplines. So we've applied it with global dairy marketing organization, we've applied it with supply chain managers, because it creates a language which allows us to share views of the future. And the scenarios for 2050 that Kat's going to be talking more about later are related to two big questions. Vertical axis is our form of global, national and local governance going to get broke? Or are we going to be able to stagger along in spite of increased population and changed assumptions of populations with the same sort of infrastructure as we've got? Will the United Nations survive? Will trade organizations survive? Will city governments look much the same as they do now, or will they be more powerful? How would governance be in the future? And crucially, we've had to think about what could cause our current structure to collapse such that new forms of governance emerged. And that's the sources of turbulence that we're going to talk about in a minute. Then the other dimension, our generation, our parents' generation, absolutely believed that geography mattered, that the people they knew were the people they'd grown up next door to them. Whereas the generation under 30, it makes strong virtual connections, and this has got very strong implications for how society works. And so what we're going to be talking about later is a scenario in which geography matters, and there's a new form of governance which is related to cities rather than nation states. We're going to be talking about another scenario which is called affinity groups, which is where affinity groups are stronger than nation states, than cities, and affinity groups could be built around language, ethnicity, religion, and a lot of the connections then will be virtual. So virtual connections stronger than geographic connections. And then the second-hand scenario is essentially like we have now, but decayed. So it's called second-hand. It's a bit grubby, it's been in a few car boot sales, and nobody's thought of anything better. And the reason that the supply chain managers were really interested in these four scenarios is that implicitly, most of supply chains are built around the concept of globalization. And globalization isn't necessarily the way we'll be in 2050. So that's just a really quick run through these scenarios. And as I say, more from Kat later. But I also said that we need to think about a changed set of scenarios, and also scenarios where something really has happened such that the world as we know it has collapsed and we've needed to rebuild societies in a new model. And so here we've got some pictures of current sources of turbulence. There is, of course, Brexit and Trump. There is the decay of the old industrial system in the bottom right-hand corner. There is migration in the top center. There's climate change and desertification in the center. And there's new sources of energy, solar power, in the top left-hand side. All of these are sources of turbulence which are changing a lot of our underlying economic models and disrupting society. And so now we're going to take a break Have a think. What do you think could cause a break in the global system? We're going to come back in 2 minutes' time. If you get a chance to, as well as getting a cup of coffee, put some messages on the messaging system that Martin briefed you on earlier. So in 2 minutes' time, after the break, Kat Tully will pick up the story of city futures in a time of turbulence. Talk soon.
Welcome back, and hello to you all. This is Kat Tully from the School of International Futures speaking now. We're going to look at how to use those 2050 scenarios that Jill discussed just now in our work today, whether you work in a particular city or on urban policy nationally or on city issues internationally and wherever you are in the world. So there are lots of different reasons to use scenarios, but we'd like to bring out 3 types of benefits. First of all is to build resilience by acknowledging different alternative futures. Secondly is the vision factor. It's to shape and co-create a desired and preferred future together. And thirdly, it's the participation piece. It's around how we create future-ready organisations and communities by having thought together about the future and how to respond as it evolves. Now, because I work quite a lot on sustainable development goals, I'm going to look at how we use scenarios within the city context, looking at some of those policies. But you do the same process if you are particularly interested in, for example, education, infrastructure, or security in cities. So the first step that you take is to explore what all the scenarios have in common. And this is a reminder of Jill's slide from before. These are the things that we assume are the case across all the scenarios. These are what the National Intelligence Council calls megatrends. They're the parameters for the plausible worlds in 2050 that we've created together. And those assumptions and parameters are that there's 9 billion people, plus or minus 2. Of those, around 70% of them are in cities, and most of the growth from now out to 2050 has been in Asia and Africa. So that's the first step. The next step is then to look at the individual scenarios in more detail. And we're going to look at the 2 most interesting scenarios that Jill identified, where there was major disruption globally in the 2030s on the journey to 2050, which meant that by 2050 we've moved away from the status quo of nation states governing, and we've got new forms of governance. Now, one version of this is city societies, and that's a world with new governance where geography matters. What does that look like? Now, there, the nation state is no longer the provider of economic growth or public services and stability. What's happened is that democracy, Western values, they just weren't up to the job and ended up being too vulnerable. So what we have in its place is a great number of city-states dotted around the world. They're the ones that provide public services and growth and security. Sometimes they replace the nation state, and sometimes they coexist alongside a weak state. But those city-states are going to vary tremendously, whether they're located, the kind of use of technology, the assets that they have, but also the size and their wealth. And city-states brands will be really important, and how they're known internationally around the world will be very important. We'll probably have a lot of mobility between states and between cities, but relationships between cities will either be very close and cooperative or potentially full of conflict. Now, an early signal that we're moving to this kind of world, this kind of scenario, is Paul Romer's work on charter cities in Honduras, if you've come across that, or Parag Khanna's work on connectivity. That is the kind of world that they describe. Now, there's lots of upsides to this world. There's lots of governance and self-organization, and that's connected to people's reality of their lives, of how they live their lives in their community, and it's connected to their values. It also harnesses the power of the local community, and because all these city-states are so different, we probably have a more resilient system globally. But you may well ask, there are probably some downsides. How do international issues and global public goods get addressed? How do you govern across so many different city-states globally? You know, it's difficult enough with 200 nation states, let alone with thousands of city-states. So it'll be difficult to have global regulation and norms. There'll be lots of regional free riding and conflict, and it's potentially a world of very great inequality. Multilateral frameworks, the UN, cooperation will have broken down. So who deals with the spillovers from inequality, and even very practically, who governs the maritime routes and makes them secure? And let's move on to the other scenario. Affinity groups, that describes a world where new forms of governance are not based on geography, but instead on virtual connections. So what brings people together in terms of community is not the space that they occupy, but the identity and the relations, the personal links. And let's look at what this kind of world looks like. We have hard-won stability in this world. The 2030s famines and crises meant that at that time you could only trust your family, your group, and that resource consumption became less important because you moved online and you had your experiences online. So your relationships are very much virtual, not in person. And so your virtual connections, there's probably around 50 affinity groups around the world, ethnic and religious, and that's the main global organizing structure internationally, not states. States are still there, unlike the earlier scenario, but they're very much watchman states. They're focused on security, not social welfare, which are provided by the groups. And so on the positive side, in this world, unlike the last world, there is an international mechanism to look at things like climate change, energy, etc. And so there is a potential for addressing global commons and public goods issues. And in fact, this world is probably using less resources because of the online engagement. However, there is, on the downside, a lot of social exclusion. You can be living next to people and having huge amounts of inequality, potentially organized crime. And the only regulation globally that will happen is where it's been negotiated between these 50 virtual global communities. Now, early indicators of moving to that kind of world is having diaspora groups campaigning on issues, especially internationally. So the Turkic groups making statements about the Uyghur communities in the west of China is an early indicator of that kind of thing. So to recap on what we've done so far, we've looked at what the scenarios had in common, and then we've looked at them individually in detail. Now we're going to take that first step and use those scenarios, now that we've got into them, to build resilience, to understand the implications using a tool called wind tunneling. So what wind tunneling does is to test how good an idea is in different scenarios. It does so by acknowledging that those different scenarios could exist, and so what your organisation or your ideas or your policies need to be potentially resilient and flexible to fit these different alternative futures. It's a very rich tool, and I could spend lots of time on it, but I'm going to keep this brief, but hopefully bring it to life by adding a third scenario, that second-hand scenario on the right-hand side, that talks about basically the world that is more or less a little bit how it is now, the second-hand scenario, where we have nation states, democracy, Western values, but a little bit less stable. So how do we wind tunnel? We first of all think through about the fact that we don't actually know what's going to happen. It could be a new world, we could have a breakdown, and if we do, it could have a geographic feature to it, or it could be a virtual world. So what we've come up with is 3 different plausible and very different scenarios. They could all happen. Secondly, we then think, what are the key different features of those worlds? How do we get things done? For example, if we want to intervene and engage with people, let's take the society line on that table. We may want to engage in a city society world by using the school contacts, engaging at a suburb level. If we were interested in having impact and engaging with people in affinity groups, we would consider using the family and diaspora. And in the current status quo second-hand scenario, we would be collaborating with other immigrants and householders. Now, the third way of using these scenarios is also to then test how resilient your policies are. So if you have the Sustainable Development Goals and you want to apply policies for sustainability in city society's world, how would you do it? You'd probably use something like the C40 type initiatives, bringing together the top leading cities and asking them to take that agenda forward. That's unlike the second-hand scenario, which is status quo, where the UN is working with nation states to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. But if we were in an affinity group situation, we'd probably be engaging with the ethnic groups and looking at trade links. So let's bring this to life with an example of Nairobi, looking at SDG policy. In the city society scenario, you may be wanting to strengthen and use the 2 dominant languages. You might be looking at the importance of investment across the city in terms of connectivity and infrastructure, and you might want to promote sustainability through education policy. In an affinity group world, Nairobi becomes very important because it's a hub and a melting pot where a lot of those cyber groups are rubbing against each other. So there's strong political and economic links from Nairobi to the rest of Africa and Asia. But when you drive across Nairobi, it could be a series of ghettos of very different languages spoken and very different communities. So we talked about wind tunneling, and let's talk about visioning, how we create desired futures. And in fact, the Sustainable Development Goal framework is actually a global visioning exercise out to 2030. And during the process of developing this framework that you see in front of you, those 17 goals, they consulted 10 million people around the world, asking them what do they want their future world to look like out to 2030? What does an equitable, prosperous and secure world look like that keeps within environmental limits? So this was the answer, this framework, which includes, by the way, a specific goal on cities to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And what countries and cities are doing now in 2017 is looking at how they take that big picture goal, which is a vision for the world, and develop a vision for themselves, for their own cities and for their own countries, to help them think through what their positive future looks like. And a scenario can help you do that by bringing people together to design what that positive future, desirable future looks like. You'll see on the right-hand side a picture of a city that many of you will recognize. It is Medellin, which is a great example of how those processes of creating and designing a positive future together can truly be transformative, where within a 15-year period, it moved from being a very dangerous and unequal poor city to one where across the board, citizens and business leaders and political leaders together co-create their future, and also the quality of life improved significantly. And that really brings me to the third, and I would like to propose to you the most important part of scenario building, which is the fact that the process of doing this participatively, the process of looking at alternative futures and creating them and coming together as a community to design a vision, a desirable future together, is incredibly important. And what it does is it means that together you can build future readiness and adaptability into your operations today as an organization and as a community, because you've had those conversations about the future. Now, we've been looking at city futures planning for the Sustainable Development Goals, and the way that visions are pulled together for cities, let me just say, they vary considerably. I'm seeing some smiles around the table here and some nods. I hope that I'd be interested in your experiences, by the way. Please do send through any case studies or examples. But when we see that they fall short of being effective, they often do so in the following 4 ways. In terms of trends, they don't really truly look at the longer term. So they'll look out for a bit, but then not really extend the trends of demography or immigration out properly and understand the implications. So the fact that the scale of those trends, if you compound them over 15 years, is truly huge. So India's urban population is expected to grow to 815 by 2050. An aging aspect of that, and that comes with problems. If you start extrapolating, it really comes with problems. For example, 10 of the 20 most polluted cities are forecast to be in India. But it also comes with huge opportunities, which is the fact that about 75% of the housing stock has not yet been built in India. And that is a great intervention point to actually create carbon neutral cities. So that's one of the challenges. The second way that some of the kind of futures and scenarios and visioning exercises at the city level fall short is that they don't always look at the complex systems, so the interactions between security and growth and public services. For example, do we look at the impact of infrastructure on maternal health or education? Do we have the engineers and the lawyers and the teachers in the room together? The third area where it often falls short is by only looking at one single future and not looking at alternatives. And particularly the fourth way that they fall short is by not participating all with the full representatives of people in the community. So what often happens is that the view of the future, is based on an Excel model based on past trends, so thinking that the past is going to happen into the future. And when we worked with UN Habitat to look at alternative futures, what happens when you include participation and disruption, that opens up all sorts of new ideas and new possibilities. So you're building future readiness and adaptability. You're acknowledging the fact that the reality will always be a mixture of many different scenarios and you get new ideas. You realize that smart cities isn't just about the technology, it's about harnessing the human engagement aspect of it. And then in terms of the size of the cities, what we find is that it's the 2 to 4 million population size cities that sometimes find it more difficult to do these exercises, and some of the larger ones have actually got the kind of capabilities to do this more strengthily. So it'll be interesting to say what does this look like on that scale of city. And finally, what we're finding is that this agenda that we, Martin, Jill and I have just been talking about, is something that's very much being integrated in these new initiatives, Habitat 3, 100 resilient cities, etc. So we're travelling in the right direction, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue on how we can continue to innovate, use the Sustainable Development Goals framework to bring in new ways to create desirable cities that are desirable for all of us. So I think we've spoken long enough. I'm going to leave you now with some questions for you before handing over back to Jill to chair the Q&A. And here are the questions I'd really be interested in hearing your answers. Number one is, do you spend enough time preparing or thinking about the future? You and your team. 2, this was the question that Jill asked earlier. What do you think could cause the kind of break in the global system that leads to the 2 scenarios that we've discussed? 3 is, what are the key risks that you see to your work should we move towards one or the other of those 2 scenarios? How does that challenge the way that you're doing things, the relationships that you've got, the structure of your organizations, what you prioritize? And finally, what kinds of responses and capabilities might work to help you to prepare for a different kind of future? So I think at that point, I'll hand back over to Jill.
Thank you, Kat. And they're really good questions. And the sorts of answers that we might expect will probably be very dependent on where people are coming from. So in sharing sessions like this, I've found, for instance, that people from Europe have got a very clear perception that city societies are going to be the way Europe gets organised. The people in the room from China were absolutely clear that globalisation was the future scenario. And the people from the Middle East, having seen countries fall apart, absolutely knew affinity societies was the way things were going. So there are going to be very major differences. We haven't had anybody volunteer anything on any of those headings, I think, unless somebody can correct me. No? I guess the thing that we might talk about while people are getting their thoughts in order, and please do put in your thoughts under those 4 headings, is how do people get started on this sort of thinking? Is it following a new 5-year plan, a new chief executive? And what do you do first if you're suddenly asked, hey, we need to do some strategic thinking about the future? And I guess the answer that all of us would suggest, because we've all done this, been there, is that you talk to other people. You talk to people who've done it. Okay? You talk to more than one person. You use the online communities that are around to find out who's done what and think about what might work and what wouldn't work in your environment. The other aspect to it, it's not just getting started, it's also, so what are you going to do with the answers? How are you going to make it happen? And this is where the importance of, Kat's discussion around participation comes in, because quite often, if you're thinking about the future, some of the existing structures will be threatened. And the only way that you can move through a time of turbulence where existing structures are being threatened is to have a wide range of inputs, contributing to the views of the future.
Yes, my views on some, just two ideas as well to add to yours, Jill. Shake out the skeletons in the closet as well. Very often, at some point in the past 5 or 10 years in your organisation, there will have been people probably doing some really interesting scenarios work and trends work, and linking into them is always a great idea. Finding out what worked and what didn't work. The other thing that sprang to mind when you were talking about your point about how you're going to use this, Jill, is I use 2 phrases, which is the burning platform and the question around what's your vehicle for change. So what's your burning platform for thinking about the future at the moment? Is it a risk angle that people have? Is it because they need to kind of engage with disruptive technology that's coming up? Understanding new partners in the space, getting under the skin of what is concerning and interesting people through getting and understanding what that burning platform is. Good. And then secondly, around the vehicle for change, it's like, what is the way that you're going to take the insights from this work forward? Is this a strategic planning process? Is it a risk management process? And getting those things clear at the beginning, I think, really maximizes your potential for impact. And, using the very good scenarios that exist already about cities around the world, your work or others, is also a good way to start in an easy, gentle way.
And following up on that, we early on did have a slide which talked about some of the experts that have got future programs. If people know of others, would they please help by putting a message through to us of other sources on thinking about city futures? And we will make sure that when we store and publicise this webinar, that we will include those sources as well.
I think one of the points is reflecting on some of the feedback that people shared on the sources of turbulence. I think this is a useful jumping off point for thinking about the scenarios. So I think some of the suggestions that we had were around health epidemics. There was quite a few relating to technology, such as AI and automation, the losers of globalization and how they may be voicing their concerns, thinking through of divergences in terms of the demographics where you have nation state failure, perhaps through immigration, and also positive trends around the emancipation of different groups in society as well.
Okay. I think that's a very interesting list, because it's got on it a number of items that relate to people's desires and ambitions. And what we're finding in a lot of futures work is that the traditional headings of sort of politics, economics, are really not what's causing the change. It's the effect of things like globalization on parts of society that's causing the change. And people have the desire to improve their life and to do something about it. And this is just so qualitatively different from a lot of the earlier economic modelling, where it was purely economic factors that cause change, whereas now people have self-actualization desires. Okay. I liked also the point about female emancipation, and of course, one of the underlying reasons that the population forecasts for 2050 have got such enormous error bars is because women are starting to behave differently. And so there is an enormous effect from education, and from public health and involvement in the labour force. And in fact, there's a very interesting study comparing the size of families in India as a whole, in Kerala, and in the US. Now, in India as a whole, from memory, the average family size was around 4 or 5. In the US and in most Western countries, it's around 2, or even lower in some parts of Europe. In Kerala, they have had 100% literacy for women and men for many years, and the family size, economically, Kerala is quite typical of other parts of India, but in terms of family size, they were more like the Western economies. Okay. So I think female emancipation is maybe something that hasn't been looked at with this angle on it in terms of its ongoing effect on society, you know. Okay. Okay. Then I guess one last question maybe. And again, if you wanted just to put one word down on your message system and send us the answer, which scenario do you think is evolving? And is there a scenario which you prefer? When we did the original report, we came to the conclusion that second-hand might be as good as it gets, which is a very depressing conclusion. But if people have come to other conclusions, we'd be very happy to hear that. Okay.
Put them back on the screen.
So, I will now hand back to Martin.
We'll take a couple of minutes just for people to take some time to reflect and post any further questions.
I've got a question for you. Hopefully not too difficult. So I think we've had experience of doing scenarios analysis and using it as a tool, and I think one of the key issues in terms of the process to reflect on is how to select the scenarios to develop further. So we obviously mentioned the wind tunnelling process to select the most significant drivers, but that could create a myriad of possible scenarios when you look at some of these big drivers. So it's useful to get your views on the sorting out of scenarios and creating these alternative worlds, and also challenging people that may be conducting the exercise to think beyond their normal limits in terms of the types of issues they're looking at, which may not be within their day-to-day remit or responsibilities even.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. There are a number of ways of generating scenarios, and some of them do rely on models which aggregate factors and end up with 20 or 30 different scenarios. Okay? And this is just very hard to work with. We find that even if you've got 5 scenarios, people really can't keep them in their mind. So then the question is, how do you get to the headings, if you like, of the scenarios to try to capture the big issues? And we've experimented with a number of ways of doing this. But the important factor for all the answers is that you need diversity. So if you do it through a workshop, you need to have outsiders as well as insiders. If you do it through building a natural agenda through a series of questions, we use something called the SAMI 7 questions, which are an open-ended set of questions about the future. And we always, when we're doing a project, suggest that people have to do a number of internal interviews with, both people new to the organisation and people making decisions in the organisation. But it's really good to do at least as many, again, outsiders. And these could be journalists, these could be regulators, these could be people in another country, another industry, to get that diversity. And then when you've got your long list of trends and drivers, including the diverse ones, then what we're finding is that using the 3 Horizons tool is a useful way of focusing on things that are in people's minds but not yet dominating the landscape. And these are the Horizon 3 things, which people discuss and realize that the Horizon 3 things are things which could change the world if they happened. And that's a good starter for a set of axes. And then there's a bit of smoke and mirrors usually in terms of looking at the things that people have talked about in Horizon 3 and maybe creating some sort of mega clusters to get some axes that push. Okay. So I'm not sure that's a succinct answer, because groups are different and processes are different, but there's a lot of experience around, and the people in the room, I think, would be happy to help with anybody who's thinking about getting started in using scenarios to think about the future of cities. And we don't have all the answers, but we know how to articulate some of the questions.
Thanks.
Right, we have one last question being typed in at the moment. Wait for that to come up, and then I'll bring this to a close. I hope that people have found this hour a useful investment of their time. We will be posting a copy of the presentation in both on the Unlocking Foresight and on the SWAF websites. And we will be setting up a community within LinkedIn to follow up the discussion that this event has provoked. So anybody who's attended today will be invited to join that. You're at liberty to accept or decline at will. But Roger, can you read out the question?
So we've had a response in from Fatima. So she's suggesting that in new forms of government, either cities or affinity groups could arise as a kind of a states Inc., particularly where global companies become leaders of national, regional or international systems. So she's thrown that one out as a suggestion to chew on.
Certainly one that is worth exploring. I think the bringing in of the corporate dimension certainly adds a completely new flavour to some of these scenarios. So thank you very much for that one. Our time is up, and thank you all very much for attending. And if you want more information, contact us on Unlocking Foresight. Come to the website, sign up for the Foresight Hub, where there are many case studies and discussions on all this. So we'll be launching a community forum in LinkedIn to discuss this, and there'll be more information on the School of International Futures website, and Adkins will also be following up on this. So thank you again very much, and have a very pleasant rest of your day. For those of you that are in America, that's the whole day ahead of you. For those of you in Asia, I wish you a very good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.